Hey guys, tonight we slip into a darker, quieter part of southern Italy, one you've probably never walked through, unless you're a sheep, a barefoot elder, or very, very lost. We're going deep into the limestone hills of Basilicata, into ancient caves that once echoed with the bleats of goats and the slow, thoughtful footsteps of shepherds. The air down here is cool and heavy, like the pause between heartbeats. Moss drips from rock ceilings, fire smoke stains the walls, and a strong, cheesy aroma, part animal, part dinner, is kind of just everywhere. You probably won't survive this without getting a little soot in your hair. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love reading those. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a stony path above a sleepy valley. The sun has dipped below the olive-dotted hills. There's a hush to the world now, the kind that only arrives after the last goat bell stops clinking. Ahead of you is a rock face riddled with doorways, except they're not really doors. They're just holes in the earth, gaping quietly, carved with bare hands centuries ago. These are cave homes, and not just for sleeping. This is where entire lives played out. Births, funerals, love affairs, cheese-making disasters, all of it. In southern Italy, particularly in the region of Basilicata, Issa, and parts of Puglia, whole communities once lived inside the cliffs. Matera is the poster child now, with its postcard-perfect stone facades and friendly tour guides who've never milked anything in their life. But centuries ago, long before Instagram discovered the Sassi di Matera, these caves were alive with smoke, stories, and the scent of damp wool. You step inside one now. It's not tall. Most shepherds weren't either. The ceiling slopes like a tired eyelid, low enough to keep the warmth in, high enough to hang a few cheeses or a bunch of drying herbs if you duck just right. A fire smolders in the stone hearth. The floor is beaten dirt, swept every day with a stiff bunch of twigs. Along the back wall, carved shelves hold oil lamps, wooden spoons, and the kind of bread that could be used as a weapon if necessary. Everything is practical. Everything has soot on it. These weren't caves in the sense of raw, untouched nature. These were domesticated caves. Sandstone and tufa, those soft, pliable rocks that basically invite you to dig into them, made it possible to carve whole rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, even small chapels with painted saints frowning gently from alcoves. Scientists still argue over when exactly this style of living began, but some date it as far back as the Paleolithic. Others say the boom came in the Middle Ages, when safety in high, hidden caves outweighed the inconvenience of living without windows. The thing is, cave life wasn't some miserable, last resort situation. It was, strangely, ideal. You were insulated from the blistering summer sun and the bone-soaking winter rain. You didn't need much to keep warm, just your animals, your fire, and maybe the body heat of someone you didn't mind sleeping shoulder to shoulder with on a bed stuffed with straw and regret. And then there were the goats, or sheep, or both, depending on your budget and patience. These animals weren't just livestock. They were the central heating system, the daily commute, and the best excuse to avoid town politics. Every shepherd had their own patch of grazing land, often many kilometers from the cave home. So at dawn, you'd swing on your rough tunic, grab your curved staff, whistle once, and the whole fuzzy congregation would start bleeding and shuffling toward the light. The shepherds knew every rock, every twisted tree along the path, and they could tell which sheep had wandered off by listening to the tone of their bells. True story. Each animal wore a slightly different bell, giving its own off-key ring in the flock's jangling symphony. A shepherd with a good ear could detect a missing sheep the way you might notice when your favorite playlist skips a song. Down here, you lived close to the earth. Literally. You cooked on it. You slept on it. You prayed in corners carved out of it. But even more than that, you trusted it. The rock held your firewood dry when it rained. It kept your ricotta from turning sour. It let you hear footsteps long before a visitor arrived. It creaked, it shifted, it groaned, and it kept you alive. Not everything was lovely, of course. There were the usual hazards of cave life: collapses, scorpions, the occasional uninvited snake who might take up residence in your pantry like a low-budget horror villain. But people made it work. Kids played in the shadowy hallways. Women plastered the walls with a mixture of clay, goat dung, and straw to keep out the damp. Old men sharpened knives on the same stone their fathers did. There was continuity here, a rhythm that pulsed through the hills like the lowing of cattle in the fog. And while cave life might seem isolated, it wasn't lonely. These cliffs were busy neighborhoods. Above one cave, you might find another stacked right on top, with a stone stair leading between them like a miniature mountain village. Neighbors passed cheese, gossip, and unwanted relatives between levels. And once a week, usually on Sundays, they'd descend into the valley together, walking single file, their mules creaking under the weight of the goods, to trade in town, attend mass, and make sure their kids hadn't forgotten how to socialize. There's something oddly peaceful about it all. Yes, it was hard. Yes, it was smoky and dirty, and occasionally involved scorpions in your boots. But these caves were home. They were cradles and tombs, ovens and altars. And tonight, you're resting in one. There's the fire, popping quietly. There's a sheep nearby, snoring a little. There's a breeze curling past the doorway, stirring the lantern smoke like lazy incense. You could stay here a while, and tonight you will. The rock under your feet isn't just rock. It's history softened by time. This is southern Italy, where geology and humanity have been in a long-term, messy relationship for millennia. And limestone? That's the couple's over-accommodating best friend. Limestone is soft. Not marshmallow soft, but soft enough that you can shape it with hand tools if you're persistent and slightly stubborn, which, lucky for us, early shepherds definitely were. Across Basilicata, Apulia, and parts of Campania, the hills and ravines are made of this pale, dusty material that practically begs to be hollowed out. You don't need dynamite or power drills, just a pick, a plan, and a lot of patience. It's why so many people here built downward instead of upward. Why bother stacking bricks when the cliff wall is already standing and rent-free? You walk along a ledge now, the kind worn down by centuries of feet and hooves. To your left, the rock rises like a frozen wave. To your right, it drops away into a tangle of fig trees, olive groves, and bristly undergrowth, where lizards skitter and wild pigs occasionally scream just to feel something. These caves weren't just hidden, they were strategic. You could spot anyone coming from miles away, and they'd have a devil of a time getting to you without tumbling down a ravine or getting headbutted by a confused sheep. But the limestone did more than shelter. It breathed. These caves regulate temperature naturally, staying cool in the heat and trapping warmth in the cold. There's a reason modern architects still look at ancient cave homes and mutter something about passive thermal efficiency with a mix of envy and confusion. Shepherds didn't need to study climate science, they just lived it. Inside the caves, walls were left rough or smooth with a slurry of lime and ash. Some were painted, not with grand frescoes or epic saints. Those were for churches. In cave homes, the wall art was, let's say, domestic. A crude cross scratched above a doorway, a chicken doodle from a bored child. Occasionally, you'd find a mysterious spiral or a crude map to someone's fig stash. Scientists still argue over whether these markings were symbolic, practical, or just the prehistoric version of Steve was here. Not every cave was a house. Some were for storage, grain, cheese, tools, sometimes even goats who needed a timeout. Others became chapels or meeting spots, and a few were for things people didn't like to talk about. Healing rituals, quiet burials. One cave even has a narrow slit in the wall where voices echo strangely. Locals say it's the ear of the rock. You can whisper a secret into it, and the cave remembers. Still, caves weren't perfect. Rain was a nuisance. Not because it flooded the homes, usually, but because it made the soft stone softer. After a heavy winter, you might step outside to find the ledge that supported your laundry line had simply crumbled away, taking your underpants with it. Entire sections of the cliff could shift subtly over time. You'd notice it first when the floor tilted just enough to make your soup run in one direction. Eventually, someone would shrug, carve a drain, and call it a renovation. And then there was light, or the lack of it. Caves tend to be, well, cave-like. The deeper you go, the darker it gets, until even the goats start looking nervous. Most people didn't dig in too far. A typical shepherd's home had just enough depth for 1 or 2 rooms, and the rest of life spilled outside. You'd eat near the doorway, sleep near the back, and leave the cheese somewhere in the middle, like a sacrificial offering to the mold gods. Ventilation was a thing too. Fires burned low and slow, fed with twigs, olive pits, and goat dung. If the ceiling got too black, or the kids started coughing more than usual, you might consider carving a hole in the wall, a window if you were feeling fancy. But many families just lived with the smoke. It was part of the cave's personality. If the air stung your eyes, it meant dinner was close. And let's not forget about water. There were no faucets, no plumbing, unless you count gutters carved into rock as plumbing, which, honestly, you kind of should. People collected rain in cisterns dug below the caves, then filtered it through gravel and old wool socks, or whatever else was handy. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Sort of. Diarrhea happened. Prayers were said. Life went on. Despite these quirks, the land itself shaped the shepherd's daily choices. Grazing paths curled along the softest slopes. Dwellings clustered near springs or shady fig trees. Roads, if you could call them that, were goat-width trails scratched into the cliffs, wide enough for a mule, but not for your ego. And that was the point. Cave life wasn't built for comfort. It was built for survival, for function, for the long game. And the shepherds, they adapted. Over time, entire communities became rock savvy. They passed down carving tips like recipes. Don't chip too much off the load-bearing bits. If you hit red stone, stop digging and maybe say a prayer. Never build your pantry over the toilet cave. That's just basic cave etiquette. It wasn't flashy, but it was resilient. When other parts of Italy burned, flooded, or were invaded by an army with too many vowels in its name, these caves just kept being caves. Silent, solid, unbothered. Tonight, as you rest inside one, it's easy to forget the chaos above ground. There's no electricity humming, no phone buzzing, just the slow pulse of the stone, the faint scent of time crushed under a sandal centuries ago, and the reassuring weight of a roof that was here before your ancestors had last names. Outside, a lizard flicks across the ledge. A single star peeks through a narrow chimney hole in the ceiling, and somewhere, deep in the stone, there's a creak. Not alarming, just the sound of rock shifting slightly in its sleep. You stir slightly, wrapped in the smoky comfort of the ancient stone, and imagine what it must have felt like to wake up here. Really wake up here. No phone alarm, no blinking LEDs. Just the steady breath of your sheep snuggled against one wall, and the faint promise of morning seeping through the cave mouth. Cave mornings came slowly, wrapped in mist and mule breath. You'd hear the earliest riser, a grizzled uncle maybe, muttering to the fire while coaxing embers back to life. The floor was cold, always, even in August. You'd sit up on your straw mattress, rub the grit out of your eyes, and reach for the one item of clothing that hadn't been stiffened by smoke or goat drool overnight. Congratulations, it's your third best tunic. Water? Not so much. You might have a basin, if you were fancy. But bathing was often a seasonal affair, which is a gentle way of saying, winter, no chance. Spring, if the goats start flinching when they sniff you. Still, there was a basic splash-splash routine. A quick rinse with yesterday's rainwater. A scrub with a rag that once had dreams of being a towel. And then you were out the door, because the sheep didn't wait for breakfast. And neither did the sun. The daily scramble began. Most cave homes open right onto the cliff face. The trail to the pasture was steep, narrow, and not designed with sleepwalking in mind. Shepherds used carved footholds, natural hand grips, and the occasional sheer force of will to haul themselves and their livestock up and out every morning. The goats were surprisingly agile. The humans, less so. Imagine trying to herd 30 sheep through a vertical funnel of loose gravel while holding your staff in one hand and a half-eaten onion in the other. That's a Monday. Still, there was something about those mornings. The crisp air, the chorus of hooves, the sun spilling over the hills like someone had just uncorked a bottle of light. You'd pause at the top, catch your breath, and look out over a patchwork of fields, olive groves, and wandering stone walls that may or may not have been meant to keep anything in. The land dictated your path. It wasn't like today's grid of roads and logic. Shepherds knew the terrain like a second language. This slope is safe after rain. That grove hides a mean badger. That ridge? Perfect for a mid-morning nap if you lie real still and let the sun soak into your bones. GPS couldn't have helped them anyway. Even modern satellites look at this landscape and sigh. Of course, there were rituals. You didn't just walk your sheep. You guided them with whistles, clicks, and names. Yes, names. A good shepherd could tell you which sheep was pregnant, which one liked to wander off, and which one had an unfortunate habit of chewing other sheep's ears. One elderly herder once claimed he could smell which ewe would birth twins. Scientists still argue whether he was joking or just wildly overconfident. Mid-morning came with a pause. You'd sit under a twisted tree, fig or carob maybe, and break out the breakfast. Some hard bread, a slice of strong cheese, and a leathery strip of sun-dried tomato. No fancy cappuccinos, no oat milk debates. Just food that could survive 3 weeks in a saddlebag and still make you weep with joy after a long climb. And the silence. Oh, the silence. Except, of course, for the sheep grumbling, the breeze hissing through the grasses, and the occasional high-pitched scream of a bird with unresolved trauma. But in between those sounds, peace. Space to think, or not think. A kind of stillness modern life has mostly traded for noise and apps with auto-renewal fees. Sometimes another shepherd passed by, herding his flock to the next hill. They'd nod, exchange a joke or a warning about wolves, and keep moving. Conversations were brief and practical. There's good clover beyond the gorge. Watch for sinkholes after the storm. My cousin's selling a mule with one good eye and a noble soul. That sort of thing. Around midday, it got hot. Southern Italy isn't shy about its sun. That same cliff that gave you warmth in winter now radiated heat like an oven. You'd retreat to a shady overhang, let the sheep lounge beneath a bush, and maybe carve something pointless into a piece of bark just to pass the time. Lunch? Usually a repeat of breakfast, but warmer. From being tucked inside your shirt, you'd eat slowly, watching the horizon, and sometimes drift into a nap with your hat pulled low. Shepherds were experts in micro-napping. 10 minutes here, 15 there, just enough to recharge without losing track of your flock. The trick was learning to sleep while listening for bells, because bells told you everything. Each sheep's bell had a distinct clunk or clink. If one bell stopped, someone was stuck. If a new bell chimed in, someone had joined the party uninvited. And if all of the bells stopped, you'd better get up, because either a predator was nearby or the sheep had found something they shouldn't be eating. Like that medicinal shrub your great-aunt swore cured hiccups, but only if you rubbed it on your knees at midnight. Back in the cave, the fire was kept going with dry dung patties. Don't wrinkle your nose. They burn slow and clean. The cave wife, because yes, that was often her unofficial title, might be kneading dough by now, slapping it against a smooth rock, humming a song about figs, revenge, or goats, depending on her mood. Evening would come fast once the sun dipped. Shadows grew long, and the limestone glowed pink like a blushing ghost. You'd round up the sheep, coax the stubborn ones with gentle swears, and follow them back to the cliff homes, gravel skidding under your sandals, your arms a little sunburned, your nose full of dust and time. You'd pass other shepherds returning from their routes. The caves would light up, one by one, from the inside. Smoke curling into the blue. Laughter drifting over ledges. A lullaby for a baby. A sneeze from an old man. And just as you reached your cave door, the sheep would settle without being asked, curling into their usual spots, sighing like they'd just finished a very long, very important meeting. Then, as the stars came out, you'd step inside. The fire would be warm. The bread would be ready. And your cave, your little pocket of earth carved into the bones of the land, would feel just right. It's dark now. Not the anxious kind of darkness. Just a soft, full-bodied quiet that wraps the hills in velvet. Back in your cave, the sheep have stopped murmuring. A few shift in their sleep, dream twitching, like oversized, woolly dogs. And you're thinking, how in the name of all that is holy did anyone ever convince themselves this was a good idea? Because here's the truth. If you lived in these southern Italian caves, you lived with sheep. Constantly, loudly, odorously. And you didn't just watch over them during the day. You slept with them, ate beside them, sometimes even argued with them, especially the older rams who seemed to think they ran the house. Sheep weren't optional. They were the reason the whole cave setup existed. Without them, you were just a person living in a hole. With them, you were a shepherd, a cheesemaker, a wool trader, a walking economy built on 4 hooves and a stubborn refusal to move in a straight line. Every shepherd had a different style. Some gave their sheep poetic names: Stella, Luna, Nuvola. Others stuck with the classics: that one, the loud one, and you again. But names mattered. You had to bond with your flock. Not because you were soft, though let's be honest, most shepherds were total softies when no one was looking, but because knowing your sheep, really knowing them, was the difference between survival and disaster. They got sick. They wandered. They tried to throw themselves off cliffs with the dramatic flair of opera singers. And when that happened, you had to act fast. Shepherds knew the signs: a flicked ear, a head droop, a sheep that stopped eating and humming. Something was up. It might be heat stroke. It might be a stomach parasite. It might be that someone slipped the sheep a bad fig as a prank. It happens. There were remedies, of course. Herbal mixes passed down from cave to cave. Strong-smelling concoctions involving garlic, vinegar, and the exact number of prayers required to make the sheep stop foaming at the mouth. Science wasn't always involved, but superstition had a long resume. You learned to read your sheep the way some people read tea leaves, and if you listened closely, they talked back. Not in words, though a few shepherds claimed otherwise, but in attitude. A happy sheep bounced, a scared sheep froze, and a sheep in love? Let's just say things got loud and awkward, but it wasn't all stress. There were long golden hours in the pasture when the sheep spread out like spilled pearls across the hills. They grazed contentedly, little tails wagging, and you sat beneath a wind-bent tree with a piece of bread, feeling, if only for a moment, like the world wasn't such a mess. Sheep were also incredibly useful. Milk, obviously. You'd squeeze it out into blackened pails with practiced hands, warm and frothy and weirdly soothing if you didn't overthink it. That milk became ricotta, pecorino, and other cheeses that aged slowly in cool stone nooks carved right into your cave wall. The smell? Somewhere between divine and never getting that scent out of your tunic. But the taste? Salty, tangy, alive, was worth it. Wool came next. You sheared in spring, before the heat kicked in. Shearing day was chaotic. Bleeding, wrestling, jokes shouted over goat farts. But the result was bundles of fleece that could be spun into thread, woven into blankets, or sold for precious coins. Every part of the sheep had value, even the bones, used in soup, tools, or occasionally as musical instruments if someone was feeling festive and deeply bored. There was one sheep in every flock, though. You know the one, the troublemaker, the climber, the escape artist. Somehow, no matter how tightly you sealed the cave at night, it would get out. You'd find it perched on a narrow ledge at dawn, looking smug, chewing something suspicious. Legend has it that some of these hero sheep were so clever they were practically employed as scouts. One shepherd claimed his lead ewe could sniff out truffles better than any pig. Another swore his ram once headbutted a thief into unconsciousness. Scientists still argue whether these stories are exaggerated or just deeply underdocumented. And then there were the lambs. Tiny, awkward, impossibly adorable. They'd totter around the cave, slip on rocks, and occasionally try to suckle anything vaguely woolly, including your socks. Kids loved them. So did grown men who pretended not to. There are records of shepherds delaying their town trips just to make sure a newborn lamb could keep up. One cave diary even includes a doodle of a lamb wearing a crown. No explanation, just his royal fuzziness. But with the lambs came risks: predators, disease, falls. The caves were safe, but the outside world wasn't. That's why most shepherds developed what can only be described as peripheral paranoia. You'd be walking, thinking about figs, and suddenly freeze because you felt something shift. Not saw, felt. A flash of movement. A silence where there shouldn't be one. Maybe a wolf. Maybe just a nervous bird. Either way, you were on it. At night, the cave door was shut with stone, wood, or if nothing else, a really heavy goat. The sheep curled up in the main chamber, breathing softly, their warmth turning the cave into a living furnace. And you? You'd settle into your corner, blanket pulled up, fire dimming. Sometimes a sheep would snore. Sometimes one would let out a little sleep bleat and kick its hooves like it was dreaming of running across the sky. You'd smile in the dark, whisper something like, "Not tonight, Luna," and drift off, knowing that the herd was safe. The cheese was aging, and tomorrow would be sheep again. The cave smells different in the morning. Not bad, just lived in. A smoky warmth laced with wool, ash, and the unmistakable tang of last night's cheese hanging above your head in a net. You stretch, bump your shoulder on the stone wall, and let out a yawn that echoes faintly through the grotto. Time to cook. Now, before you imagine a sprawling modern kitchen, let's recalibrate. This is a cave kitchen. There's no sink, no fridge, no granite countertops unless you count the literal granite. What you do have is a blackened hearth dug into one wall, a collection of soot-coated pans, and the wisdom of 1,000 grandmothers passed down through gritted teeth and burnt fingers. Cooking here isn't just a necessity, it's an event. Smoke curls lazily from the hearth, threading through the one tiny chimney hole your uncle once chiseled after nearly asphyxiating himself trying to make flatbread. It doesn't draw well, but hey, character. Breakfast starts with milk, fresh from the sheep if you're lucky, or still warm in its clay jug from the evening before. A quick fire is coaxed to life using dry twigs, a few olive pits, and that trusty flat of dried dung patties. Again, stop flinching. They burn slow and clean and smell only marginally worse than your cousin's socks. Today's menu? Ricotta. And it's not the stuff in plastic tubs at the supermarket. All bland and watery and sad. No, this is cave-born ricotta. Thick, creamy, slightly tangy, made in a dented copper pot older than the Pope. You heat the whey gently over the fire, stirring slowly with a wooden paddle, worn smooth by generations of sleepy stirring. The surface begins to froth, bubbles winking at you like the cave itself is in on the recipe. A splash of lemon juice or vinegar, whatever's on hand, and there it is. Fluffy clouds rising to the top, warm, earthy perfume curling around your nose. You scoop the curds into a cheesecloth-lined basket and set it aside on a cool ledge to drain. The smell? Sublime. The pride? Immense. The leftovers? Turned into soup, fed to pigs, or smeared onto yesterday's bread with a pinch of salt and a hopeful sigh. But the kitchen wasn't all cheese all the time. Cave dwellers were surprisingly versatile cooks, especially considering their toolkits were mostly rocks, fire, and attitude. Bread was a staple, flat, dense, and made with flour that had been bartered or begged for from nearby towns. Yeast? Sometimes. More often, a sourdough-style starter lived in a crock by the door, guarded like a pet. The dough was slapped onto hot stones, flipped with a stick, and sung to, apparently. Yes, sung. Many cave families had traditional songs for bread making, simple, rhythmic tunes meant to keep the baker's timing steady and maybe, just maybe, ward off whatever spirit kept making the crust split in weird places. Scientists still argue whether this helped with the rising or just distracted everyone from how smoky it was. And then there were the ovens. You didn't have one, usually. What you had was a section of rock, smoothed and shaped into a sort of primitive bake dome. Heat it with fire, scrape out the coals, then bake in the residual warmth. It took timing, skill, and a robust sense of smell to avoid charcoal loaves. If something burned, well, you fed it to the sheep. They weren't picky. Cheese and bread might be the stars, but the supporting cast was strong. Olives from gnarled trees clinging to the hillside, wild herbs, rosemary, oregano, thyme, plucked fresh and stuffed into every pot like edible confetti. Chickpeas boiled for hours, lard spread on toast like a guilty secret. Even dried fish brought up from coastal traders and stored in tightly sealed urns that made every child in the cave gag when opened. Preservation was key. You couldn't waste food. Not when the next market day might be canceled due to rain, a landslide, or your mule deciding it was done with capitalism. So meat was salted and hung from ceiling hooks. Tomatoes were sun-dried on flat stones. Jars of preserved eggplant lined shelves like edible sentries, each sealed with a glug of olive oil and a prayer against mold. And because cave people weren't robots, there were treats. Honey-sweetened cakes made with chestnut flour, fritters fried in shallow pans, dusted with sugar if the harvest had been good. Children would press figs into little clay molds and pretend they were sweets, while the real candy, hard, anise-flavored, was hoarded by grandmothers like currency. Meals were communal. There was no dining table, just a patch of floor swept clean and circled with cushions, crates, or flat-bottomed stones that pretended to be chairs. Everyone shared from the same bowl, dipped with the same bread, told the same joke 3 times until even the sheep sighed. And if there was a guest, you gave them the warmest piece of bread and the second best chunk of cheese. First best went to the eldest. No discussion. By evening, the kitchen glowed with the last fire of the day. Someone strummed a lute or hummed something half-remembered. Children pretended to be bandits, then promptly fell asleep under the spice shelf. A pot of soup bubbled on the stones, laced with chickpeas, garlic, and whatever meat hadn't walked away fast enough earlier that week. Cooking in a cave required creativity, patience, and a total disregard for what modern chefs would call sanitation. But somehow, everything tasted better here. Maybe it was the smoke. Maybe it was the hunger. Maybe it was the centuries of repetition etched into the cave's walls, whispering the right way to salt your stew. As you lie back now, belly full, a wedge of cheese tucked safely under a stone for tomorrow's breakfast, the fire begins to die down. Shadows lengthen. The last curl of steam drifts up and out the chimney hole, disappearing into the cool night air. And the cave, like a contented cook, exhales. The bread has cooled. The fire has dipped into glowing silence. And now, at the tail end of a long day, the cave smells like comfort, like old stone, fresh ricotta, singed herbs, and wood smoke braided into wool. A sleepy hum fills the air, goats shifting in their straw beds, a child muttering nonsense in their dreams, someone 2 caves over, sneezing like they're trying to exorcise a demon. And yet, the main character of this moment, the smell of singing bread. Yes, singing. Sort of. See, when cave bread was baking, especially on flat, scorched stones inside dome ovens, the crust would crackle in the heat, tiny popping snaps like whispered applause. If you leaned close and listened, it sounded like murmuring. Or, if you had a little wine and a lot of imagination, like the bread was singing to you. Shepherds and grandmothers alike swore by it. A quiet loaf meant a dull day ahead. A chatty loaf, good grazing, and no tax collectors. Cooking in these caves was part science, part folklore, and part trial by smoke. Everything stained black eventually. The walls, the ceiling, your nose hairs. People didn't so much clean the soot as shift it around. There were no chimneys in early cave dwellings, just holes. And holes, as it turns out, are extremely bad at subtle airflow. So each time a fire was lit for baking or boiling, the entire cave transformed into a slow roasting oven for its own inhabitants. You'd squint through the smoke, stirring your chickpeas, dodging sparks, waving a chicken feather fan like it mattered. And yet, no one left, not for long, because the bread would start to sing, and the smell, oh, the smell, was too good to walk away from. Flatbreads were most common, made with coarse flour, water, and a bit of salt. Or old starter, they were flattened onto hot stones or slapped onto the inside walls of clay ovens. A good cook knew the temperature not by thermometer, but by holding her palm inside the oven until her eyebrows tensed. If you didn't pull the bread fast enough, it turned into a discus. If you pulled too early, you got sadness. There was no middle ground. Unless, of course, you were the dog, then every outcome was delicious. Even more magical was the ritual around seasoning. In the caves of southern Italy, olive oil was liquid gold, poured generously when times were good, drizzled cautiously when the harvest had been lean. A slab of bread could become a meal with just a splash of oil, a pinch of salt, and a sprig of wild oregano rubbed between your palms. Some families added crushed garlic. Others swore by chili oil strong enough to cure both a head cold and your marriage. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In one village, families whispered that a sprig of oregano placed beneath your breadstone would charm the loaf into rising higher. If you burned the bread 3 times in a row, you were expected to light a candle for St. Anthony and apologize out loud to the oven itself. Scientists still argue whether this practice had any measurable effect, or if it was just a polite way of redirecting blame from the baker to the divine. Meal prep wasn't just about sustenance. It was performance. Children watched the kneading with fascination, half hypnotized by the rhythm. Men hovered near the fire, pretending to inspect the tools while clearly just hoping to sneak a corner of bread. Occasionally, neighbors would pop their heads in with commentary. Too much flour, not enough salt. That looks like my cousin's face. Helpful stuff. Sometimes music happened. Not with instruments always. Those were for festivals. But with hands, claps, soft humming. Women sang while turning cheeses. Men whistled while stirring polenta in big copper pots. Even the sheep got in on it, letting out background bleats in a sort of rustic harmony. The whole cave felt like an oven of life, things bubbling, rising, settling, and filling the air with stories. And then there were the foraging days. You'd wake up early, strap on a bag, grab a stick, and head into the hills in search of flavor. Wild onions, chicory, fennel, escaped herbs from someone's overzealous garden. If you found mushrooms, you had two choices. A, eat them, or best may be, take them to the village elder with the least to lose and see if he survives. No one ever remembered which ones were safe. But hey, risk made the food exciting. On foraging days, the bread got a makeover, stuffed with greens, topped with onions, sometimes turned into a pie with layers of mashed chickpeas, herbs, and enough garlic to chase away ghosts and guests alike. People brought their haul back to the caves like war trophies, proud and leaf-smudged. What wasn't eaten fresh got sun-dried, packed in salt, or stuffed into clay pots. And in the evenings, that's when the smells turned truly hypnotic. Picture this: a cave, glowing orange with firelight, steam curling from a shallow pot of beans and rosemary, children chasing each other between sleeping sheep, and in the middle of it all, an old woman bent over a pan, flicking oil onto thin dough, coaxing it into golden puffed rounds that crackled as they cooled. She hums. You don't recognize the tune. Maybe it's for the bread. Maybe it's for you. The meal comes together slowly. Bowls are passed around. Bread is broken with fingers. Someone drops a piece in the fire. A baby cries. A dog farts. And yet somehow it's perfect. Because food in the caves wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. About feeding everyone with what the land gave you, what the animals offered, and what the fire didn't burn too much. You made do. You made memories. And sometimes, you made very questionable stews that you had to eat anyway because Nona was watching. As the fire dims and the last slice of singing bread is tucked into a cloth for tomorrow's walk, the cave quiets again. Not empty, just satisfied. There's a warmth in the walls now, soaked in by stone, released like a secret. You exhale, the taste of rosemary still on your tongue. And somewhere near your feet, a sheep lets out a soft snore. Like it, too. Just had the best meal of its life. Outside the cave, the moon is climbing the sky, like a sleepy farmer checking on the night's work. Inside, the glow from the hearth fades, and a different kind of warmth rises, not from fire, but from hearts beating a little faster. Because tonight, in a corner carved out of rock, two people are awkwardly making eye contact while pretending to inspect a cracked cheese pot. Yep, it's time to talk about love. Cave life didn't stop romance. If anything, it made it harder to avoid. You lived close. You worked close. You passed the same people on the same trails every week. And eventually, after the 10th shared glance over a suspicious goat, something sparked. Courtship among shepherds was a delicate dance performed in heavy boots, mud-streaked tunics, and the lingering smell of sheep. But don't let the rustic aesthetic fool you. There was flair, there were rules, there was drama. It usually began at the communal gatherings, religious festivals, market days, maybe even funerals if we're being honest. A young man would spot a girl stacking olives or scolding a mule, and suddenly the world narrowed to two things: her face and the crippling fear of her grandmother. First step, the serenade. Now, this wasn't just a trope. It happened. A shepherd with a flute, a voice, or at least a confident whistle would appear outside the cave of his beloved at dusk and play a tune. It was rarely good, but it was heartfelt. The goal was to impress the girl, and maybe the entire extended family, who was definitely listening from behind the curtains. If she liked what she heard, she'd toss something down, a flower, a ribbon, or, in one case, recorded in a faded diary, a small round of cheese. True love. If she didn't like it, silence, or worse, a bucket of water. Not metaphorical, literally dumped from the ledge. Rejection was rarely subtle in cave communities, but let's say she did like him. Then came the tricky part, spending time together while pretending you weren't. Families were big. Caves were small. Privacy was non-existent. So couples got creative. They offered to watch the goats together. They took the long route to the spring. They volunteered for foraging runs that mysteriously took all day and came back with exactly one onion and a suspicious grin. During these moments, hidden under fig trees or sitting side by side on a stone outcrop, the real conversations happened. Dreams, jokes, plans, and occasionally, deep philosophical debates like, how many sheep does it take to be considered wealthy? Or, would you still love me if I got kicked by a mule and walked funny forever? If things progressed, there were signs. Carved initials in stone, a scarf left behind on purpose, and sometimes, most romantically, a shared shift in the night watching the sheep. Just two figures in the dark, listening to the breathing of animals and the occasional ghost story-worthy groan of the cave. Holding hands was risky, but if a goat stepped on your foot, who could tell? Proposals didn't come with rings. Rings were expensive. What you got instead was a promise, usually made in front of elders, over bread and wine, while both sets of parents exchanged skeptical glances. The bride's family might ask for a dowry. The grooms might promise a fresh-cut ledge for the couple's new cave apartment. Yes, apartment. Because sometimes, caves were extended upward or sideways to accommodate newlyweds. One cave over for mom and dad. Two caves over for grumpy uncle. Privacy still minimal, but hey, at least the view was yours. Weddings were communal affairs. Everyone pitched in. Bread was baked by the dozens. Chickens were sacrificed with dramatic flair. A goat was roasted. Someone tried to play music on a 3-stringed lute. There was laughter, awkward dancing, and at least one drunk relative falling into a water cistern. Afterward, the couple moved into their cave. Blank walls, shared bed, leaky roof. It didn't matter. They were together. And from there, life began again. Babies wrapped in wool, lullabies hummed through rock corridors, arguments over cheese placement, and dreams etched into stone beside the fire. But love in cave society wasn't just young love. There were long married couples who still teased each other across the hearth. Grandmothers who had outlived 2 husbands and now bossed the entire ledge with a walking stick and pure willpower. Widowers who carved little altars for their wives, tucking flowers and flatbread into stone niches as quiet tributes. And there was heartbreak, too. Not every love story ended with carved hearts and shared goats. Sometimes a boy fell for a girl from a rival pasture. Sometimes sickness came. Sometimes someone left and never returned. And the only sign was a flute gathering dust in a corner. One fringe tale tells of a shepherd who fell in love with a cave spirit, an apparition that appeared only in moonlight and sang in a language no one understood. He never married, lived alone, talked to the cave walls. And when he died, villagers claimed they heard music echoing from his empty home for 3 nights straight. Scientists still argue whether that was an auditory illusion, a wind trick, or just a very committed prank by bored teenagers. Regardless of the form, love found a way, in the cracks, in the rituals, in the quiet moments between chores. And the caves, they remembered. Carved initials remain on ledges. Heart-shaped stones still line old doorways. Faded cloth scraps tied to fig trees flutter in the wind like forgotten promises. So tonight, as you lie near the embers and listen to the last sigh of the fire, think of them, the lovers, the shy glances over sheep backs, the carved love notes beside the olive pots, the shared silences that meant more than words. And if the cave seems to hum softly around you, well, maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe, just maybe, someone long gone is still serenading from the stone. You wake to the sound of hooves, but not the normal kind. These aren't your sheep, and they're moving fast. Someone's running down the ledge outside your cave, cloak flapping, muttering a curse under their breath. And just like that, the quiet rhythm of cave life is broken. It's story time. Because for every bread-singing shepherd and love-carving newlywed, these caves also echoed with legends. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, whispered by firelight, believed or half-believed depending on how late it was and how strong the wine had been. You're in southern Italy now, the land of saints and sinners, wolves and witches, and at least one very committed, one-eyed bandit. Let's start with him. His name's been lost to time, or maybe deliberately erased, but every child on these cliffs grew up hearing about the one-eyed bandit. He was a shepherd once, they say, until a jealous cousin hit him with a shovel during a particularly heated cheese dispute. He lost his eye, his patience, and apparently his grip on moral reasoning. He disappeared into the upper caves, the ones too steep and narrow for anyone sane to live in. And from there, he started robbing travelers. But not just any travelers. The bandit only stole from the wealthy, never harmed the poor, and had always left behind something strange. A flower tucked in the saddlebag, a single coin etched with a goat. Once a wedge of stolen cheese was returned days later with a bite missing, and a note that read, "Too salty." No one ever caught him. Some say he died alone in a cave with only bats for company. Others claim he was a ghost all along. And a few older villagers swear, under their breath, that he still watches the cliffs, keeping an eye, literally, on anyone who grows too greedy. Scientists still argue whether he ever existed or was just a metaphor for anti-capitalist dairy redistribution. And he wasn't the only tale etched into cave air. There's the legend of La Gallina Santa, the holy chicken. Supposedly, a poor shepherd boy once saved a white hen from a fox. That night, the chicken began to lay golden eggs. The boy grew rich, too rich. He bought silk shoes and annoyed everyone. One day, the chicken vanished. People claimed they saw her walk straight into a cave and never come out. Every so often, someone swears they hear her clucking at night, deep within the rock. If you find her, the story goes, she'll lay one egg, just one, for the pure of heart. Everyone else, they get pecked. Then there's the tale of the cave that screams. High in the hills, carved above a cliff so sharp it makes birds nervous, is a tiny crevice, too small to live in, too crooked to use for storage. But locals say that if you press your ear to the stone at dusk, you can hear wailing. Some say it's the voice of a woman who lost her children to a mudslide. Others believe it's an old hermit who read the stars wrong and cursed the heavens. One kid, emboldened by fig wine, claimed he heard the cave whisper the name of his crush. He never told her, moved to Milan instead. The caves weren't just homes. They were theaters, sanctuaries, haunted stages for centuries of storytelling. And because life here was quiet and hard, people needed stories. They gave shape to fear, meaning to accidents, and rhythm to routine. A rock slide wasn't just geology. It was punishment for taking figs without asking. A twisted root was the mark of a sleeping giant. A breeze down your neck? Definitely the ghost of a sheep that never got sheared. But not all legends were terrifying. Some were downright useful. One recurring tale across several villages involved the Whispering Rock. Supposedly, if you had a decision to make, marriage, trade, naming your sixth child, you went to this particular stone, placed your hand upon it, and waited. If you felt a pulse, that meant yes. If it stayed still, no. If the rock burped, which yes was reported, the answer was ask again later. Strangely enough, most versions of this rock were located near wine cellars. And then there were the cave marks, little carvings in the stone, spirals, stars, arrows. Some were just idle doodles. Others, maps, warnings, blessings. This ledge collapses, one mark might mean. Hide cheese here, another. You could follow a spiral path for miles across cliffside homes. Some say, like a secret language, only the caves understood. Archaeologists have tried to decode them. Scientists still argue whether they form a rudimentary system of shepherd graffiti, a mystical trail map, or just bored teens with sharp rocks. Children were raised on these tales. They huddled under blankets while their parents wove stories between sips of hot barley tea. The walls of the cave flickered with firelight as legends came alive. Flying goats, talking winds, shadowy creatures with the faces of old uncles who owed you bread. And the caves listened. They remembered. Every creak of the rock, every echo of a name shouted across the ravine, every kiss, every theft, every whispered wish. The caves absorbed it all, not like walls, but like witnesses. So when you lie down tonight, back pressed against that cool, time-worn stone, you're not alone. There's history breathing around you, footsteps pressed into the floor, air shaped by 1,000 stories. Maybe, just maybe, you'll dream of the one-eyed bandit, or the golden hen, or a girl with fig leaves in her hair who never stopped waiting on that narrow ledge. And if you wake in the night and hear a soft sound, not quite wind, not quite sheep, well, maybe don't ask too many questions. Rain in the south of Italy doesn't always arrive politely. It doesn't trickle in with gentle warning. It erupts. 1 minute, you're dozing beneath an olive tree, thinking about cheese and taxes. The next, the sky cracks open like a dropped pot, and all of nature decides to unload its feelings in your general direction. When you live in a cave, this becomes a whole situation. Rain comes downward, yes, but also sideways, upwards, if the wind is drunk enough. It sneaks in through doorways, trickles down ceilings, and slides in through cracks you could have sworn were sealed yesterday. You wake up in the dark with a wet toe, grumble something ancient, and reach for the closest bucket. Again, the rock helps. Limestone is porous, breathable. Most cave homes were designed to shed water, gutters carved into the stone, runnels angled just so, drainage holes leading into gravel pits. But when a real storm hits, one of those legendary, goat-lifting Mediterranean deluges, it's like trying to stay dry inside a sponge with aspirations of being a waterfall. Shepherds prepared in their own ways. Buckets lined every wall. Straw was stuffed into ledges like makeshift insulation. Blankets were hung from ceiling hooks not to dry, but to divert. You'd lie in bed with a dripping rag slowly soaking your forehead and think, maybe the Romans were onto something with those villas. Still, storms had their own rhythm, and shepherds knew how to dance with it. First came the wind, curling around the cliff edges like it was testing the locks. Then a few teasing drops. A sheep sneezes. Someone yells, "Shut the fire," and suddenly you're in motion. The kettle is saved. The cheese is covered. The cat, if you had one, is already hiding in the straw pile. You throw a tarp over the doorway, a patchwork of waxed cloth, old tunics, and wishful thinking, and brace for impact. And then, boom! Thunder hits like a god tripping over a barrel. The whole cave shakes. Dust sprinkles from the ceiling like nature's unwanted seasoning. Children squeal. Grandmothers shout. Someone grabs a ladle and starts emptying the floor drain, which is now bubbling like a cursed spring. The sheep, meanwhile, act completely unfazed, chewing, blinking, occasionally pooping in places they know are sacred. But there's also something deeply cosmic about storms in the caves. You huddle with your family, wrapped in blankets. The fire flickers wildly, painting shadows like moving saints on the walls. Outside, the wind screams across the hills, pushing clouds so low they brush the cliffside like angry whales. And in that moment, you feel small, but also placed, like a rock in a stream, not resisting, just staying put while the world crashes overhead. You'd think the caves would be terrifying during this, and sometimes, yes, they were. Rock shifts, ledgers of rainfall. A creak too loud could mean erosion. But mostly, the caves held. They'd been here for centuries, carved by hand, reinforced with wisdom, superstition, and sheer stubbornness. When storms came, people trusted the rock. They whispered thanks to it. Some even kissed the floor before bed during the worst weather. Scientists still argue whether this was spiritual or just very tired gratitude. Shepherds had weather signs too. They read the wind. They watched the way ants moved. One shepherd claimed he could tell rain was coming by sniffing the goat's ears. Another swore the local lizards barked in warning. You laugh now. But when you're 30 miles from town with a bag full of cheese and only 2 dry socks between 4 people, you start listening to the lizards. After the storm passed, the world looked reborn. The air was sharp with ozone and crushed oregano. The cliffs steamed softly, shedding their damp coats in curls of mist. Puddles glimmered in the morning light like fresh coins tossed across the stone. Shepherds stepped outside and stretched like cats. Children dashed barefoot through the mud, only to be yelled at and dragged back inside for a cleansing with vinegar, which they absolutely hated. Everything dripped, from ledges, from overhangs, from that one ceiling crack you keep meaning to fix. But everything also smelled alive. Dirt, thyme, wet wool, and the quiet exhale of a cave that survived another battle with the sky. There were rituals afterward. Fires were relit. The best cheese was unwrapped as a celebratory snack. Roof stones were checked, ledges swept, and stories told. Every storm got its own name, its own legend. The year the thunder rolled twice. The one where the mule vanished, and came back dry. The Great Soup Spill of 1847. Evenings after storms were special. The land glittered, the sky cleared, stars returned, bashful and beautiful. Neighbors called out from cave to cave, checking in, laughing, exchanging goat gossip. And deep in the stone, the warmth began to return. There was something beautiful about surviving together, not in the epic movie hero way, just in the quiet, damp socks, shared ladle, I didn't lose any cheese kind of way. And when you lay down to sleep that night, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of garlic and goat, the sound of dripping water was like a lullaby. Tonight, the air is calm again. The wind has stopped pacing. The cave floor is dry. Outside, the crickets resume their nightly orchestra like nothing happened. And somewhere in the distance, someone sings softly. Not for the gods or the rain, but maybe just for the bread. Night in the cave is not the kind of night you know. It's thicker, slower, a kind of velvet dark that wraps itself around you like an old friend with cold hands. There's no refrigerator hum, no car alarms, no glow leaking in through double-glazed windows. Just a flickering ember in the hearth and the sounds. The ones you don't notice until everything else falls quiet. And these caves, they are not silent. They breathe. A long, low exhale through narrow doorways. A soft, barely there whistle where the wind slips past stone lips. A creak in the roof that sounds eerily like someone shifting in their sleep. The walls aren't haunted. Not exactly. But they remember. And every so often, they sigh, as though stretching after a long day of holding history on their shoulders. You lie still on your straw bed, listening. First the sheep, always the sheep. Their breathing is slow, rhythmic. One lets out a huff, another a sleepy bleat. Sometimes they shift, clattering a hoof against the stone. And somehow, their collective exhale begins to blend with the cave's own. You're not sure where the animals end and the home begins. Then there's the drip. Somewhere, always somewhere, a droplet falls from stone to stone, maybe from the ceiling, maybe from the rim of a water jug left open. But that plink, it's like a metronome in the dark. You start to wait for it. Listen for the gap. Count the seconds. And in the gap, your thoughts begin to slow. Shepherds were attuned to these night sounds. They read them like lullabies or warnings. A sudden stop in the sheep's breathing, trouble. A gust of wind bending through the chimney hole, weather coming. A mouse skittering across the shelf. Time to put the ricotta higher up. One fringe tale even claimed that caves spoke at night, that if you pressed your ear to the wall and listened hard enough, you could hear the past. Births, songs, arguments, the sound of someone carving a name into stone and whispering, "Please remember me." Scientists still argue if limestone can retain acoustic vibrations. You lie there and wonder what your cave has heard, and if it's judging you for snoring. There were no clocks. Time was counted by the fire. A full log might burn for 3 hours. A small branch, an hour. Shepherds slept in shifts, especially during lambing season. You'd wake every few hours, poke the embers, check the animals. Maybe sip a bit of leftover broth from a pot. It wasn't insomnia. It was rhythm, cave rhythm. And dreams were different here. People claimed they dreamed deeper, more vivid. Maybe it was the stone, or the air, or the sense of being wrapped in earth itself. You dreamed of fields, of goats turning into clouds, of your uncle yelling about taxes while riding a flying mule. You'd wake up confused, laugh, roll over, and listen to the cave breathing beside you. Every now and then, a sound would break the pattern. A shout in the distance, a sharp bleat, the unmistakable thunk of a rock falling where it shouldn't. You'd sit up, heart pounding, eyes straining in the dark. Was it a predator? A thief? The one-eyed bandit back for his cheese? More often than not, it was just a goat rolling over too enthusiastically. But the adrenaline stayed with you. That's why shepherds developed what we now call hyper-local ears. You didn't just hear sounds, you understood them. A distant cough? That's Nona 2 caves over. A yawn? Probably Marco with the noisy donkey. A flutter of wings near the fire? That weird bird again that everyone swears is extinct. You knew the soundtrack of your cliff. One surprisingly mainstream fact, many caves had sound traps, little ledges, hollows, or flared doorways carved specifically to enhance echoes. They acted like primitive security systems, amplifying the sound of someone approaching. A footstep on gravel could echo like thunder through a well-designed entrance. That's why cave doors weren't always square. Some were shaped like hourglasses, some like keyholes, not for style, for sound. And inside, the night never truly settled. Children turned in their sleep. Grandfathers mumbled about mules and taxes. Someone let out a heroic snore that echoed down the corridor and startled the dog. You smiled, turned your head, and pressed your cheek against the cool stone. Not cold, cool, grounded, steady. This was safety. Not the locked door, alarm code kind, but the ancient kind. The kind that comes from being wrapped in rock that has never once betrayed you. Through storms, through hunger, through joy and plague and war, these walls had held firm, watched over families, protected bread, guarded newborn lambs, and whispered lullabies to sleepy lovers. And the cave never forgot. One woman, old as the hills, once said her cave had taught her how to sleep. That before moving in, her mind raced. But after a month of listening to the rock and the sheep and the wind, she no longer fought sleep. She welcomed it like an old friend who always brought warm soup and no judgment. Maybe that's what happens to you now. The fire is down to its last ember. The sheep are quiet. The cave has stopped sighing. Even the drip has grown less insistent. You let your eyelids fall. Feel the straw under your palms, the stone at your back, and the faint rhythm of cave breath folding into your own. Outside, stars climb across the inky sky. A fig tree rustles, and deep inside the cliffs of southern Italy, you, modern you, city-born you, headphone-wearing you, are no longer an outsider. You are part of the cave. Morning creeps in slowly, brushing a thin layer of silver over the cave mouth. The fire is out. The sheep are already rustling, and somewhere above your head, the faint, unmistakable creak of mule hooves reminds you it's market day. In the quiet hustle of cliffside life, market day was both celebration and survival. For a shepherd living in caves, it meant one thing: movement. Down the trails, across the mud roads, into the chaos of town, where prices were guessed and friendships tested. But first, you had to get there in one piece. Your mule is waiting, slightly grumpy, as all mules are before breakfast. His name is probably something like Giuseppe or Thunder or that stubborn beast, and he has no patience for your existential musings. He wants hay. He wants it now. You toss him a handful, pat his bristled neck, and start loading the cargo. Cheeses wrapped in cloth, dried herbs tied in bunches, a jar of something pickled you can't quite identify. Packing a mule is an art. Balance is key. One side too heavy, and he'll walk sideways. Too noisy, and he'll sulk and protest halfway down the trail. Shepherds used wool blankets to cushion the loads, old rope for harnesses, and a kind of whispered negotiation to keep the mule from cursing their ancestors. The trail into town is steep, rocky, and in wet weather, an Olympic event in balance and profanity. You take it slow, step, pause, adjust. The cheese jiggles with each movement. The mule sighs dramatically. The sheep? They stay behind, watching you go, like fuzzy children sent off to school without breakfast. The mud roads were named with biting sarcasm. They weren't paved. They weren't reliable. They were, however, very muddy, especially in spring when the clay turned into something between soup and sabotage. Shoes disappeared in it. So did tempers. But there was no avoiding it. The path connected the cliff homes to the town, and the town to the rest of the world. Still, the road had its moments. Fig trees arched overhead. Birds followed your progress like nosy neighbors. Occasionally, you'd pass another shepherd. Mule, load, expression identical, a nod. Maybe a short complaint about taxes. Maybe a compliment on your goatskin bag. But usually, just the silence of people, too focused on not falling to bother with conversation. And then, finally, the town appears. A cluster of stone buildings, sun-baked and slanted, built in defiance of gravity and common sense. Market day transforms it. The square buzzes with barter, shouts, smells that hover somewhere between divine and suspicious. Tables sag under the weight of olives, fabric, garlic, and the occasional live chicken trying to escape commerce altogether. You find your usual spot, between the guy selling salted anchovies and the woman offering questionable remedies for joint pain. You lay out your cheeses, smooth the cloth, and smile with exactly the right amount of desperation. Shepherds weren't just farmers, they were negotiators. They learned the art of the deal long before email scams or influencer codes. A round of aged pecorino might fetch a bolt of cloth. A cured sausage, maybe a jar of honey or a knife sharpener. There was haggling, always. Prices were suggestions, influenced by mood, weather, and how much you looked like you'd walked there without breakfast. Then came the tax collector. Dressed like a man who hadn't seen a real job in decades, he wandered between stalls, nodding, jotting, occasionally pocketing something for inspection. He asked questions like, "Is this cheese certified?" And, "Has this bread been weighed?" To which the shepherds responded with long blinks and phrases like, "It's very blessed," or "The goat approved it herself." Taxes were rarely paid in coin. More often, they came in cheese, bread, or vague promises of future lambs. One bold shepherd once offered the collector a free serenade and half a bottle of walnut wine. It worked. Once. Still, markets were more than economics. They were theater. You met people, shared gossip, compared mule injuries, spied on your cousin's engagement negotiations, bought gifts, like a tin brooch for your wife, or a new whistle for the kid who wouldn't stop asking why sheep can't climb trees. You traded goods. You traded stories. You heard about far-off places. Naples, Palermo, even Rome. Cities that felt more like myths than destinations. One mainstream geographical fact. The towns of southern Italy often formed around these trade routes. Market days weren't just traditions. They were the glue. Shepherds came from miles around, converging like dusty pilgrims, their mules clinking with bottles, bells, and the occasional contraband sausage. After hours of standing, smiling, haggling, and explaining that yes, the mold is supposed to be there, you packed up. Fewer cheeses now. Maybe a spool of thread in exchange. Maybe a jar of sun-dried tomatoes you'll pretend you picked yourself. Your back aches. Your mule looks personally betrayed. Time to climb back. The return trip is quieter. The road is familiar, even if your feet aren't thrilled. A slight drizzle begins, softening the trail and your mood. You pass the same trees, the same stubborn goat who always watches you from a ledge like a judgmental gargoyle. The cave looms ahead, glowing faintly with firelight, smoke curling lazily from the vent. Inside, everyone leans forward to see what you brought. Bread is broken. The new herbs are passed around. Someone pretends they like the gift you got them. The mule collapses in his stall with dramatic flair. You settle near the fire, peeling off your damp tunic, and unwrap the last cheese, hidden, of course, beneath a bundle of straw, your secret prize. The market is done. The stories are told, and somewhere in the corner, a child is already pretending to sell rocks to the dog. Practice makes perfect. It's a peaceful evening in the cave. The fire's crackling, the cheese is safe, and someone's poking a stick into the ashes purely for the joy of stirring something. But not every night was so calm. Because for all their simplicity and tight-knit traditions, cave communities still had one universal human trait: the occasional, spectacular disagreement. When you pack dozens of families into a cliffside network of interconnected dwellings, add livestock, hunger, and a chronic shortage of privacy, it's only a matter of time before someone steals someone else's goat, blames a cousin, and hides the evidence under a pile of onions. Welcome to cave justice. There were no formal courts here, no powdered wigs, no long-winded arguments about legal precedent. What you had were rocks, ropes, elders, and a firm understanding that if you caused too much trouble, your bread might mysteriously never rise again. Let's start with crime, cave style. Theft was the big one. Not just of valuables, what valuables, but of essentials. Milk, flour, eggs, tools, and, yes, goats. Goats were like walking wallets. If one went missing, panic ensued. Accusations flew. Entire days could be spent examining hoof prints like primitive forensic detectives. If you were caught stealing, there were consequences, public ones. A thief might be paraded through the village with a sign around their neck: cheese thief, or tool borrower with no return intentions. A few unlucky souls were dunked in the cistern as a warning, which was both humiliating and deeply unpleasant in January. But it wasn't all punishment. Justice here was more about balance. Elders, usually a trio of the oldest, most eyebrow-heavy men in the village, would gather at the central ledge to hear the case. These weren't trials. They were discussions. Loud, dramatic, occasionally involving reenactments. One memorable dispute over a stolen salami ended with both parties forced to share a loaf of bread and just get over it already. Mediators weren't judges. They were respected because of age, wisdom, and in some cases, the sheer volume of cave-based trivia they could recite. You say this man stole your goat, an elder might say. But did you check under the fig tree? That's where Enzo's sheep wandered in 09. We all remember. A pause. Nods all around. Case closed. Sometimes, punishments involved restitution, giving something back or replacing it with something better. You took her butter, give her your best candle. You insulted his uncle, you owe him a jar of olives and your best apology face. It worked, mostly, because people had to live next to each other afterward, and revenge rarely made the cheese age faster. But not all crime was so simple. Sometimes things got darker. Accidents that weren't quite accidents. Feuds that dated back generations. A sudden fire. A sheep found poison. In those rare moments, caves whispered. People lowered their voices. No one liked to believe evil lived inside the rock. But sometimes it did. And then there was exile, the harshest punishment in cave law. If someone crossed the line too far, violence, betrayal, or repeated violations of the goat code, they could be sent away. Not into the wilderness, but to a neighboring village, or a more distant cave cluster, where no one knew their crimes. It was brutal, worse than a beating. You lost your fire, your ledge, your neighbors. And caves, as it turns out, don't forget the absence of voice. But not all justice was reactive. Much of it was preventive, based on community, ritual, and watchfulness. Shepherds took turns watching for threats. Not just wolves, but troublemakers. Anyone walking the cliff paths after midnight was watched. Children were raised with rules like, don't borrow a pot without asking, and never touch another man's mule without permission and gloves. Gossip, while mostly entertainment, was also surveillance, and women? They were the real intelligence network. Nothing escaped them. They knew who argued over firewood, who swapped wine for favors, who secretly visited a widow 2 caves over under the guise of cheese inspection. If a conflict was brewing, they knew first, and often diffused it with bread, warnings, or thinly veiled threats involving broomsticks. Cave law had its quirks, too. One fringe rule held that if 2 people argued over something neither could prove, like who first claimed a patch of grazing ground, they had to settle it through a contest. Sometimes a race, sometimes a bread-baking duel. One infamous dispute ended with both men standing on one leg while holding jars of sheep milk above their heads. Winner got the land, loser got drenched. Dignity optional. Another strange but true tradition. If someone told a lie during a dispute and it was discovered, they had to sing the truth the next day in the square. Imagine admitting to hiding your neighbor's rake in song, while half the village clapped along. Scientists still argue whether this was justice or just the world's slowest musical comedy. All of this functioned not because of laws written on paper, but because of memory written in stone. You lived among people who remembered, who saw your face every day, who knew what your laugh sounded like when you weren't guilty. Justice was woven into the architecture, tight, interconnected, impossible to escape. At the end of the day, people went home to their fires, to their bread and sheep. Grudges faded, most of the time. And if not, well, there was always next market day to settle things with a well-aimed side-eye and a suspiciously sharp hunk of pecorino. Tonight, the cave is peaceful again. No arguments echo from the ledges. No mysterious hoofprints mar the path. The cheese is unstolen. The goats are accounted for. And somewhere near the door, the old broomstick leans quietly against the wall, ready, just in case justice needs a little encouragement. Tonight, the fire burns a little brighter. not because of cold or hunger, but because someone's telling stories again. Not the kind with bandits or romantic goats, but the other kind. The kind that walk the fine line between belief and science. The kind that blur the edges between saints, stars, and stomach aches. Welcome to the sacred, strange, and softly glowing world of cave superstition. In these southern Italian caves, shepherds weren't just herders. They were stargazers, homegrown herbalists, and part-time philosophers. They lived so closely with the land that not believing in signs would have felt reckless. Life was too delicate, too dependent on weather, soil, and sheep moods, so they looked for meaning everywhere. Let's begin with the saints. Every family had a favorite. St. Anthony watched over animals. St. Lucy, the eyes. St. Ruch, plagues. Little shrines were carved into cave walls. Tiny alcoves housing soot-covered icons, bunches of dried thyme, a candle stub, and perhaps, if the day had been particularly rough, a piece of bread or a splash of wine as an offering, a sort of divine bribe. These saints weren't distant. They were neighbors. You spoke to them like you'd speak to your cousin. Pleaded, argued, even scolded. St. Anthony, I asked for help with one lamb birth, not triplets and a broken toe. They listened, or didn't, and life went on. Then came the remedies. If your child had a fever, you didn't rush to town. You reached for the fennel, the garlic, the olive oil. You brewed teas from rosemary and thyme, rubbed crushed basil on sore joints, smeared honey on burns. One popular cure for nightmares involved placing a chunk of old bread under the pillow. Another involved whispering your fear into a rock and throwing it into the ravine. If the goats ate the rock, you had to start over. Obviously. Were these treatments effective? Sometimes. Scientists still argue whether cave communities had unusually strong immune systems or just a lot of trial and error until only the hardy survived. Astrology also had a strong foothold, not in the glossy horoscope sense, but in the deeply observational, the stars are watching way. Shepherds could read constellations like maps. They tracked the moon's phases not to be romantic, but because certain days were better for cutting wood, shearing sheep, or baking bread. A new moon was lucky. A full moon was suspicious. A red moon? Time to stay inside, double-check your cheese, and maybe postpone that wedding. Even weather had superstitions. Rain on a Wednesday meant bad luck for the market. Thunder during bread baking meant the loaf would fail unless you sang to it. If lightning struck near the grazing cliffs, you had to sprinkle salt in the cave entrance the next day, just in case the spirits were offended. And then there were the healing zones. Now, this is where things get truly odd. Certain caves, just a few, were believed to hold special power. Not magical exactly, but charged. People said the air felt thicker there, that wounds healed faster, that bread rose without yeast. Skeptics scoffed. Believers returned again and again, laying quietly on the stone floor, palms pressed to the ground, eyes closed, waiting to be rewoven. Geologists claim it's the mineral composition, high limestone content, humidity, maybe even trace radiation. Locals don't care. To them, these were holy places, caves that pulsed like hearts. Entire families would travel miles to sleep there for one night, especially if someone was sick or expecting a child. And more than a few elders claim to have dreamed of their ancestors in those spots, clear as day, offering advice about sheep breeding and soup recipes. One shepherd long since gone, swore his limp disappeared after spending 3 nights in the breathing hollow, a low-ceiling chamber, half swallowed by moss. "The cave took it," he said. "I gave it my pain and some figs." Nobody questioned the trade. Divination was practiced quietly. A bowl of water, an egg yolk, a mirror, or even the way steam curled off hot soup. These were tools, not to see the future exactly, but to sense what was coming. Some people claimed they could read messages in goat droppings. Others watched how the smoke from the fire bent at night. If it curled toward the door, you'd have visitors. If it stayed low, a secret would be revealed. If it spiraled straight up, congratulations. No one was pregnant, getting married, or hiding a crime this week. Children were protected with amulets, often made from coral, bone, or carved wood, hung above cribs, worn around necks. Some carried tiny pouches filled with dried herbs, stitched shut by grandmothers with eyes like hawks, and sewing fingers that had never missed a stitch. And cave births, they were halfway between ritual and miracle. Women gave birth in the warmest chamber, surrounded by whispers, steam, and the scent of rosemary. The child was washed in warmed sheep's milk if water was scarce, wrapped in linen, and passed through a circle made of goat horn, a symbol of protection. If the baby didn't cry immediately, someone sang to it, loudly, off-key, as if scaring it into breath. Not everything was gentle, though. Curses were real. At least people believed they were. Envy was dangerous. So was pride. If your sheep multiplied too quickly, or your bread turned out too perfect, you might find a dried olive branch tied to your door in the shape of an X. That meant someone was jealous. Someone was watching. Time to burn sage, or garlic, or both. Time to spit 3 times and walk backward out of your cave before sunrise. You laugh now, but living close to the bone of the earth changes how you think. These weren't ignorant people. They were observant, attuned, open to possibilities. They saw how everything connected, moon to plant, sheep to storm, birth to stone. And when you live like that, nothing is just coincidence. Tonight, the fire glows low. Someone has just told a story about a child who grew up with second sight and once predicted a landslide with her dreams. No one questions it. The room is quiet. The cave listens. And just as your eyes begin to close, you hear someone whisper, "Did you feel that?" The cave just breathed again. By the time the trucks came, coughing dust across the cliffs and spilling out men with clipboards and city shoes, many of the shepherds had already known it was over. The caves, faithful, smoky, comforting caves, were being left behind. Not all at once, not violently, but slowly, like a curtain being drawn over a life too simple for modern taste. The exodus from cave living in southern Italy didn't begin with fire or war. It began with pavement. In the mid-20th century, governments and planners, horrified by the primitive conditions of the cave dwellers, no plumbing, no electricity, or shared air with sheep, decided that enough was enough. Progress, with its asphalt boots and concrete dreams, had arrived. They called it modernization. The shepherds called it leaving home. You might think people would be thrilled. Real homes, lights that worked, stoves that didn't smoke you out. But it wasn't so easy. Because when you've lived cradled in stone, where every crack and ledge holds the thumbprint of your grandmother's grandmother, plaster walls feel cold, lifeless. The new housing developments were built fast. Rows of neat little buildings painted cheerful colors. Plumbing, yes. Tile floors, metal railings. In a sense, to many former cave dwellers, that the soul had been scrubbed clean right along with the soot. Not everyone left voluntarily. Some caves were condemned. Entire districts were labeled unsanitary. Residents were relocated with a combination of promise and pressure. The story of Matera is well known, how its Sasi, the ancient cave quarters, were emptied by decree. But this pattern echoed across the hills, in dozens of villages where cave homes were simply closed. Families packed their things, blankets, tools, the old ladle with the goat-shaped handle, and walked away. Sheep were sold, cheese racks left to dry, bread ovens cooled for the last time. Some took their doorstones with them, small chunks of the cave floor wrapped in cloth, carried into their new homes like relics. Scientists still argue whether this shift was necessary. From a sanitation point of view, absolutely. From a cultural point of view, deep sighs and long conversations ensue. What's clear is this: something was lost. Something that doesn't come back just because you plug in a fridge. The transition was rough. Mules didn't adapt well to city streets. Chickens weren't allowed on balconies. The new ovens baked evenly, but the bread didn't taste right. Without the stone walls to absorb the moisture, the cheese aged too fast, or too slow, or not at all. The cheese misses the cave, one woman said. No one laughed. Children struggled too. They liked electricity, of course. They liked running water. But they missed the echo, the warmth of being wrapped in stone. One boy, newly relocated, refused to sleep in a bed for a year. He made a nest beneath the stairs, curled up with a pillow and a flashlight, whispering to imaginary goats. And then there were the elders. They aged fast, away from the cave, not just physically, but emotionally. The rhythm of cave life, the fire tending, the ledge sweeping, the bread baking at dawn had been their clock. In the new homes, time moved differently. It ticked, it beeped, it didn't breathe. Many stopped singing. Some stopped speaking altogether. A few resisted the move entirely. They stayed, hid, carved new paths higher into the cliffs, became outlaws in their own land, watched from afar by officials who eventually shrugged and marked them as relocated on a form, because who would check? These holdouts lived without electricity, without visits, but they lived with the cave, and that to them was enough. One story tells of a couple who refused to leave. Every week, their son would walk up from the new village, bringing bread, medicine, a battery-powered radio. They'd greet him with hugs, make him soup, and politely refuse his offers to help them move down. When the cave is done with us, they said, it'll let us know. And slowly, the caves emptied. Weeds took over the thresholds. Wind moved in where sheep once slept. The soot faded. The shelves gathered dust. And yet, strangely, some spaces stayed intact, as though the caves themselves were waiting, watching, holding their breath. Because here's the thing. The caves didn't mourn. They endured, like they always had. Years passed. Then decades. Some were repurposed. Storage, cellars, artist studios. Some collapsed. Some were rediscovered by tourists who gasped at the charm of candlelight on stone and then paid €200 a night to sleep like a peasant. But a few caves remained untouched, locked, quiet, holding inside them the ghosts of bread and lullabies, of arguments over goats and stories whispered beneath fig-dappled stars. And those who had lived there, really lived there, never quite let go. You could hear it in the way they spoke of home. Not the house they lived in now, but the cave. The one with the smoky ceiling and the carved shelf for the wedding wine. The one where bread rose without clocks and the wind knew your name. Tonight, you sit by the fire in your imagined cave, feeling the presence of what once was. The stones around you are tired, maybe, but they remember. You feel the weight of absence. The people who left, the mules who trudged down the mountain one final time. And you wonder how it felt that last night. Did they sleep? Did they cry? Did they reach out and press one hand to the wall, hoping it would forgive them for walking away? The cave said nothing, of course. It never does. But deep in the earth, the silence shifted just slightly, like something exhaling through a crack in the stone. The cave is empty now. No fire. No smoke curling out of the ceiling hole. No clatter of hooves on stone. Just you, standing in the cool hush of memory. These ghost caves are scattered across southern Italy like fossilized sighs, places that once throbbed with life and now sit quiet, sun-dappled and crumbling. And yet, even without their shepherds, they feel alive, like they're just resting. Some are easy to find. Pathways still lead to them, though the ledges are worn thin and the brambles lean in like nosy aunts. You duck through a low entrance, feel the temperature drop, and suddenly you're inside someone's old story. A fire pit, blackened and cold. A ledge that once held cheese, now dusted with lichen. Faded scratchings on the wall. Initials? A child's drawing of a sheep. You run your fingers along the grooves. The stone is cool, but it holds warmth if you wait long enough. No one lives here now, but no one quite left either. Outside, the fig tree still stands, twisted, blooming, determined. Beneath it, a worn-out bowl rests in the grass, chipped and mossy. You imagine someone set it there 70 years ago, meaning to pick it up after milking. But life shifted. A cousin came with news. The market called, the trucks arrived, and the bowl stayed. The goats are gone, but sometimes wild ones pass through. They pause at the cave door, sniff the air, and move on. Some locals say they can still hear the bells at night, ghost bells echoing across empty valleys. Scientists, of course, explain this as sound bouncing strangely through limestone corridors. But you know better. The air smells like rosemary and thyme. You breathe it in. Let it settle in your chest. If you close your eyes, you can still hear it all. The laughter, the whistling, the gentle clink of a ladle against a stone pot. Someone singing bread again. Someone scolding a sheep. Someone just burned the soup, and no one's letting them live it down. There's no plaque here, no tourist sign, just wind and stone and silence. And yet it feels sacred. Not because saints lived here, though they might have, but because people did. Real people, with real hands and real hearts and very real goats that refuse to cooperate. In some places, the old dwellings have been restored, turned into guest houses or cafes. A few offer authentic experiences, filtered through Wi-Fi and wine lists. But the real caves, the ones untouched, they resist. Cracked, slouched, stubbornly beautiful. Nature is creeping back in, of course. Moss on the bread shelf. Ivy in the corner where a cradle once stood. Birds nesting in what was probably a salt jar. It's not decay. It's evolution. The caves are adapting again, as they always have. And even now, some people return, not to live necessarily, but to remember. Elderly men climb the old paths, leaning on canes, pointing at walls like they're greeting friends. Women press their hands to the stone and whisper names. Children listen, half bored, half mystified, not quite understanding what all this space used to mean. One man brings his grandchildren every spring. They picnic near the cave. He tells them about the goat that liked figs and the time his cousin tried to make soap and nearly burned off his eyebrows. He shows them where the fire was, where the bread rose, where he once carved a heart into the wall that's now hidden behind moss. The heart's still there, of course. So are all the others. The caves don't erase, they preserve, like memory foam for human lives. They absorb what you give them, songs, tears, footsteps, and hold on to it just in case you come back one day needing to remember who you were. So tonight, as the stars begin to prick through the dark, you sit at the mouth of the ghost cave and listen. The wind brushes past you. A stone shifts somewhere in the wall. Maybe it's the cave settling, or maybe it's just breathing again. You exhale. Let it go. Let the quiet wrap around you. The shepherds are gone, but the caves remain. Patient, steady, watching, ready for whatever comes next, even if it's just you sitting here dreaming of a loaf of singing bread. Word count 1088. Wind down 300 words. Let it all fade now. The cave grows darker, the air still. The stories slow their spin and settle like dust in the corners of your mind. No more footsteps. No more bleating sheep. Just stone, soft and endless, holding everything gently. Breathe in. The scent of rosemary and smoke lingers faintly in your memory. Familiar now, almost comforting. You feel the weight of a blanket woven from old wool and older love tucked snug against your shoulders. The fire is down to its final glow, just a pulse of warmth in the dark. Outside, the fig tree bends in the breeze. The leaves make that slow, brushing sound, like a lullaby hummed by the earth itself. Above, stars crowd the sky, unblinking, bright, watching over cliff and cave alike, just as they did for the shepherds who came before. And you, resting here, are part of it all now. No hurry, no noise, just you, and the rock, and the rhythm of a world that moves gently, quietly, endlessly. Let your breath slow. Let your mind ease. Let yourself drift past the cave mouth, past the goat paths, past the hills stitched with stone walls in time. Let yourself go still. You are safe. You are warm. And somewhere, deep in the stone, a lullaby is being remembered. Sleep well now.